The Splatana Wiper is hands down one of the best main weapons in Splatoon 3. Ever since it got its painting buff in the chill season, the weapon has been super prevalent in the meta, and that hasn't changed since then. It's been one of my main weapons for quite some time now, and I think I've finally reached the point where I've used the weapon enough to make a detailed guide. Lots of people asked me to make a guide sooner, but I wanted to wait until I had enough experience with the weapon to guarantee that I could make the best guide possible. In this video, we're going to go over a lot, including the basics of the weapon, pros and cons, advanced techniques, playstyles, and gear. This video won't be covering the recently released Splatana Wiper deco, since that weapon has a different playstyle and could probably have its own video. But that's not to say that certain things discussed in this guide couldn't be applied to the Wiper deco. It is the same main weapon after all. Before we get started, if you enjoy guides like this as well as other competitive Splatoon content, be sure to subscribe. I have a lot more guides like this in the works. First up, let's discuss the basics. The Splatana Wiper is supposed to be, well, a windshield wiper. As with every Splatana, this weapon has two ways of attacking. It has horizontal swipes, which can be spammed rapidly. This is primarily how you'll be painting and moving around with this thing. Each horizontal swipe does 30 damage from a distance, making it a 4-shot kill. That seems weak, but this thing can fire so fast that it's pretty reliable. The projectiles from horizontal swipes are very wide, so you have some leeway in regard to how precisely you need to aim. If you do a horizontal slash when you're right next to someone, it'll do 45 damage, which is a bit stronger. But this weapon can also perform a charge slash by holding down the ZR button, which has a few aspects to it. When you release the charge, it'll fire off a vertical projectile. This will inflict 60 damage, and it also goes a bit farther than the horizontal swipes. But this comes at the cost of it being way harder to land than a horizontal swipe. The hitbox of the vertical projectile is much narrower, requiring you to be way more precise. You can also release a charge slash when you're right next to an opponent, which will result in a critical hit, splatting them instantly. This is great, but it can be very hard to pull off since you need to hit your target directly. If you hold forward on your left joystick while you release a charge slash, your character will lunge forward before performing the attack. This is a situational move, but it can be really handy to give yourself a little extra distance. Next, let's discuss the pros and cons of the Splatana Wiper. This weapon has a lot of positives, so this is going to be a large section. First, the Splatana Wiper is a lightweight weapon, so it gets some built-in speed perks that other weapons wouldn't normally get. Those speed perks help out with my next point, which is that the weapon is just extremely fast. The weapon's strafe speed while spamming horizontals is ridiculous. I mean, look how fast this is. You can dip in and out of the ink at a blazing speed, sending out slashes in between. This allows the weapon to have a very distractive playstyle, which I'll get into a bit more later. While it doesn't paint as well as the Splatana Stamper, the Wiper still paints exceptionally by spamming horizontal swipes, allowing it to charge up Ultra Stamp relatively quickly. It also has Torpedo as its sub-weapon, which can paint a ton in itself. While we're on the topic of the kit, the synergy the main weapon has with it is simply fantastic. Torpedo allows you to perform a variety of combos, which helps make up for the main weapon's relatively weak damage. Ultra Stamp just lets you amplify its already aggressive playstyle, allowing you to directly follow up with teammates or create a path yourself. Every Splatana also has insane object damage, and the Wiper is no exception. Like, look at Wavebreaker. It only takes one charge slash and one horizontal swipe to destroy it. It's also great at destroying other subs and specials, like Crab Tank, Booyah Bomb, Splash Wall, Sprinkler, and many others. Lastly, the weapon just isn't very gear dependent. There are some abilities that top players tend to consistently run on it, which I'll cover later on in the gear segment, but just know that the weapon doesn't necessarily need any abilities to be able to perform well. When it comes to cons, there really aren't that many. I mean, this weapon is good for a reason. I'd say the main negative is the weak main weapon damage. If you don't have enough ink to throw a torpedo and an enemy is trying to fight you, you need to have some pretty good movement and mechanics to be able to win that fight. The other issue with the weapon, and this goes for all Splatanas, is that there's no type of curvature or fall off to the weapon's projectiles. It all just goes in a straight line. This can be good, but it's also bad since the weapon can struggle to get kills around certain slopes and walls that other weapons would have no problem with. Luckily, the weapons kit can help immensely with this. We'll be covering playstyle next. As I alluded to earlier, this weapon has a very distractive playstyle. It's fast and sneaky, so you'll find yourself forging paths for your teammates and going on flanks a lot. If you've ever used the Tetradualies before, it shares a very similar playstyle. Officially, the Wiper would most likely be labeled as a skirmisher, but it can honestly take on some other roles as well. I know that a lot of you have already seen my quick respawn video, where Pro Chara and I go super in-depth as to how a quick respawn weapon should be playing. Well, the Splatana Wiper is a quick respawn weapon, and I actually talk a lot about its role in that video. To avoid being redundant, I'm not going to repeat everything I said there, but I'll link the video in the description if you're interested in checking that out. Highly recommend if you haven't seen it yet. But in a nutshell, the Splatana Wiper is a weapon that starts fights for your team and creates openings. It's capable of getting a lot of splats, but that's not the main thing the weapon is trying to do. Your main goal is to get the enemy team to look at you, while the rest of your team moves up and takes advantage of your distraction. The way the weapon fires is also great for helping out teammates who are already in a fight. Let's now go in depth with some advanced techniques for using the Splatana Wiper. None of these are all that hard to do, it's just a matter of practicing them and knowing when to use them. Let's start with the most basic one, the torpedo roll. Knowing this one combo is going to help you out so much on Wiper, but know that it can be applied to pretty much any torpedo weapon. You can always throw a torpedo at an opponent, but rolling it on the floor has a lot of benefits. First of all, the enemy can't destroy it when it's rolled, they kinda just have to take it. If the explosion is somewhat near them, it'll inflict 35 damage. If it hits them directly, that'll do 60 damage. This can help out Wiper so much in fights, since it'll take less swipes from you to finish off an opponent who's already weak from the torpedo. Plus, as you already know, torpedo is just great for scouting people out. Throw it in a spot where you suspect someone might be sharking to reveal their location. Next up is, well, I'll be honest, I don't know what the community calls this really. I hear a lot of different names for it, but I'm just gonna call it swipe dashing. All this is essentially main strafing. Dip out of the ink, do a horizontal swipe, dip back in, swim a little bit, dip back out, horizontal swipe, then rinse and repeat. Again, this is just taking advantage of the Wiper's insane movement. Doing this can confuse enemies a lot since you're moving all over the place and you're therefore a harder target. I've won so many fights just because of this technique. One thing I'll say though, and you're gonna hear me say this a lot with the next few techniques, is don't do this if you don't have to. When I was learning these techniques, I would end up doing it when it wasn't necessary at all. Like, for example, if an enemy has their back turned to you and not a lot of paint around them, chances are you can just kill them by continuously horizontal swiping. You don't need to overcomplicate things. Next, we have critical hit flick practice. When trying to land a critical hit on an opponent, it's very rare that you'll just be able to walk straight up to them and be able to land a shot without turning your camera. That'll pretty much only work if their back is turned to you. Most of the time in a fight, you'll have to do a quick flick by anticipating their movement, like this. You can train for this by replicating these flicking motions on the dummies in the training rooms, but be sure to train many different angles. Don't just do the same one every time. I'm able to land crits pretty consistently now after practicing this so much. Again though, don't try to land a crit if you don't need to. A lot of times I'll die trying to go for one, and after I'm dead, I just think to myself, man, I probably could have gotten that kill and survived if I just horizontal swiped. Sticking with the charge slash, let's practice leading our vertical swipes. As I mentioned earlier, the projectiles are a lot narrower than the horizontals, so they take some good aim. You'll have to anticipate enemies' movements a lot. You can practice flicking at the stationary dummies from a distance, but for this I'd also definitely recommend practicing on the moving dummies. This is more realistic since opponents are obviously going to be trying to move away from you, so practicing leading shots on these dummies is going to benefit you a lot more in the long run. I know a question that many people are going to have is when should you use a horizontal swipe versus a charge slash? There's no 100% concrete answer to this, but if you know you're able to land a charge slash on them, then go for it. Just remember though, it's a lot harder to land than a horizontal swipe. What I typically find myself doing a lot is I'll start out a fight with a charge slash to go for some quick big damage. If I miss, oh well, the enemy is looking at me now. so it's safer to switch over to horizontal swipes since they're more reliable to hit. Similar to rollers, Splatanas are really good for camping people under ledges. If the enemy gets right up near the ledge, you can just crit them to quickly take them out. But even if the enemy isn't in crit range, you can still jump and perform some charge slashes to get some good damage off on them. That's actually a benefit from the weapon's lack of projectile curvature. Jumping while charge slashing can also let you get some cheesy kills on crab tanks from the front, so be sure to incorporate this sometimes. Jumping while horizontal swiping is very easy to do, but it's also very easy to overlook. It actually took me a while for me to start incorporating this, because it's something that I just didn't really think about. I mean, a ton of other weapons jump up and down while they shoot, so why not Wiper? It makes you just that much harder for enemies to hit. I've also noticed that this is a very good way of dealing with opposing Splatana Wipers. I pretty much always win my fights if the enemy doesn't jump, but I do. But if the enemy knows what they're doing, they'll probably start jumping too, which can lead to some really funny looking fights. Lastly, let's talk about the lunge. Personally, I don't find myself using the lunge that often, but it does get me a clutch kill once in a while. I find myself often using it around a corner or wall when I think an opponent is about to reveal themselves. This allows you to gain some extra distance for a crit while you're still protected by the wall. The lunge is ultimately just a prediction game. If you think the enemy is going to rush in a certain direction, then try and lead your lunge into them. Notably, you can also lunge directly after super jumping in. I've gotten a ton of cheesy kills with this, and it's also a way to sometimes avoid immediately dying on landing. It's sort of like a built-in drop roller. One thing I want to point out is that when you first try to learn the Splatana Wiper, you're going to accidentally lunge a lot when you don't intend to. Don't worry, because this happened to me too. As you continue to use the weapon, you'll learn to subconsciously hold the joystick in a different direction or let go of it when doing a charge slash, so don't fret about this too much. You can also jump while charge slashing to avoid the problem entirely. So those are what I think to be the most important techniques to learn and practice for the Splatana Wiper. These certainly aren't the only ones out there, but knowing these is going to give you a good baseline to work off of, and will definitely give you an edge over some other players in solo. And remember, even though I split all these techniques into their own section, that doesn't mean you can't combine them. For example, you can hit a single charge slash and then proceed to swipe dash to finish off the enemy. There's really endless possibilities with this weapon, and that's why I love it so much. Now, I wanted to go into a bit more detail on Ultra Stamp, because that is a big part of the kit. Now, this isn't an Ultra Stamp guide, so I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of how the special works or how to use it, but rather, I'm just going to give you some of the best tips that I've picked up throughout my Wiper journey. I do have the golden Ultra Stamp badge, so I like to think I've had a good amount of experience with using the special. As I mentioned earlier, Ultra Stamp is great for the Wiper because the special sorta does exactly what the main weapon tries to do, just on a more amplified scale. Use it to create openings for your teammates, or try to create a distraction with it. When this special is popped, the enemies are definitely going to be looking at you, because Ultra Stamp can easily wipe out the entire enemy team if they're not careful. With that being said though, the Ultra Stamp user needs to be careful as well, because it's quite easy to die while using it. When stamping, your entire back is exposed, and while the special is supposed to shield you from the front, it does a pretty crappy job. So my first tip is simple. Try to avoid popping it when you're already weak. If you use it at full health, the chance of you rushing in and taking out enemies before they're able to kill you is relatively high. But if you're already one shot away from dying, it's going to be pretty easy for the enemies to capitalize off of that and just shoot you once through the hammer. However, sometimes using a panic Ultra Stamp is your only option to get out of a situation. But just keep this tip in mind. To avoid being easily shot at through the front of your hammer, a very helpful tip that I've adapted into my gameplay is to always try and use Ultra Stamp around walls or corners. If you stick near a wall, that's one less angle that an enemy has to shoot at you, compared to just using it out in the open and completely exposing yourself. And if the enemy is also near the wall, there's sometimes literally nothing they can do, and those are the best kinds of Ultra Stamp kills. As most of you know, besides rushing people with the Ultra Stamp, the special has another mode, throwing it. Throwing the stamp can be very hit or miss because it requires some pretty good aim, and the hitbox of the stamp is quite large, so it can very easily get caught on a wall or object. But if there's no enemies around you to be rushed, and you see a good opportunity to go for a stamp throw, do it. There's really nothing to lose. Even if you're using the rush mode, a good strategy is to toss the stamp right as the meter is about to expire. As long as you release the R button before the meter is depleted, the game will carry out the stamp throwing animation. The last thing we must cover for this guide is gear. What are the best abilities to run for the Splatana Wiper? To help with this distractive playstyle, you're definitely going to want to run some quick respawn. It doesn't need to take up your whole build like the Tetra Dualies, but run a decent amount of it. I'd say roughly 3 mains or 9 subs worth is a good baseline. I do also think that Stealth Jump is quite nice on this weapon, although some people do opt to run Object Shredder. I personally don't run Object Shredder because the weapon already has insane object damage, but if you really want to destroy stuff like wave breakers and splash walls as fast as possible, then it might be for you. I think Stealth Jump is the superior option, just because it makes jumping back in and grabbing the enemy's attention that much easier. Now, here's where things become a little more personal preference. Comeback, Last Ditch Effort, and Haunt are all amazing abilities for the Splatana Wiper. The issue though is you really only have room to run one of these if you're choosing to stick with a quick respawn / stealth jump build. Now for me personally, I don't run Haunt. Don't get me wrong, the ability to see people through walls and respawn punish them is great, but I prefer having some form of assistance with a torpedo. So that leaves us with Comeback or Last Ditch Effort. Again, you can really run either of these on any mode, both of them suit the weapon really well. Since Last Ditch Effort is so good on Splat Zones and Turf War, I usually run it for those modes. But for every other mode, I run Comeback. Every perk that Comeback gives helps out the Wiper immensely, even if it's only for 20 seconds. Both of these abilities allow me to use torpedoes a lot more comfortably, which in turn leads to more combos and more success. Here's the builds that I currently run, and most top players run something similar. I just want to reiterate though, this weapon isn't super gear dependent. Yes, quick respawn and stealth jump are what's most common in the current meta, but that doesn't mean that you have to run it. Just run what you want, but be mindful of the weapon's playstyle. Alright guys, well that's about it for the Splatana Wiper guide. Now this video didn't go extremely in depth, but again that wasn't really the goal. Just like my previous Tetra Dualies guide, I wanted to provide a good foundation for people who are interested in the weapon, while also sharing a couple tips that might help out some more experienced players on the weapon as well. No matter of how much you've already used the Splatana Wiper, I really hope you enjoyed this guide. If you did, please give it a like and consider subscribing if you haven't already, because this video took a lot of work. But with that being said, I want to make more guides like this in the future. Between this guide and my last full weapon guide, it was about 2 years. The Dart Tetra guide that I made back in Splatoon 2 took me about 3 months to make, and I got so burned out that I was kinda turned off from making any more weapon guides. But I took a bit of a different editing approach with this video, and I was able to get it done much faster, which has sort of reignited my fire for making this type of video. So you can expect another one in the coming months. Alright, that's gonna be it from me. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.